Hey guys, it's time for our math lesson today. Yesterday we started our brand new chapter on geometry. I figured, it's time for a little bit of a shift in gears. Last chapter we were working with long division and you guys did a wonderful job. With this chapter, we're not going to be so much working with numbers as we are with lines and with shapes. And that's what geometry is. Geometry is a way that we can use all the things that God has given to us to build, to express ourselves in art. And so knowing the basics of geometry is very important. Now, yesterday you began your chapter by learning about lines and the different characteristics of it. All right, just as a review. All right, so we know a line is a set of points that travels continuously from one into the other. It is represented by arrowheads because it doesn't have an end. It continues to move on and move on and move on forever and ever. Amen. Okay, it can be moving from left to right, and it can be moving up and down or diagonally, but whenever you see these arrowheads, that's what that represents. The opposite of a line would be a line segment. Well, maybe not the opposite, but they're related but very different. A line segment is represented with dots on either side. And it has dots because it shows that it has a beginning and it has an end. Okay, I can measure this line segment. Whereas this line can't be measured because it doesn't stop. It doesn't have a beginning, doesn't have an end. So these are the two different types of lines that we have. Well, today we're going to be talking specifically about the lines. Okay, lines that continue on and on. And there's basically two different types of lines. Okay, and if you have your math packet, we are on lesson 8.2, and this is on page 211. All right, I'm going to just read this very short lesson. At the very top, it says there are many poisonous snakes and non-poisonous snakes in Europe. It says they have a picture of two snakes, and it says these snakes are traveling exactly the same direction. They are example of parallel lines. Now you look right underneath it, it says that these snakes are crossing one another. They are example of intersecting lines. All right, so first let's look at this one. Parallel lines are lines that are the same distance from one another. And because they're the same distance, they never touch. They continue traveling side by side. It's almost like two good friends just going for a nice long walk, and they never end up bumping into one another because they always stay the same distance. Parallel lines. The other type of line is called intersecting lines. Intersecting lines, they continue moving continuously in a particular direction, but these two lines are going to end up touching one another. Okay, and that's why I have them right here in this way. They can intersect in lots of different ways, but intersecting, they just touch some way, somehow. All right, and in your book, they've given you some lines where they've labeled them with some letters, and they've shown you, again, different examples of parallel and intersecting lines. I figured, you know what? In nature, God's creation, we see examples of geometry and lines everywhere. So take a look at these pictures and see if you can identify them as parallel or intersecting. All right, let's take a look. There's some cute little pictures here. Here's the first one. Look at this feller. All right, it's a squirrel. All right, it looks like it might be a certain squirrel in Europe. I've never seen a squirrel with these type of ears. And speaking of his ears, look at the way that they're sticking up. Would you say that these are examples of intersecting lines or parallel? Well, I hope you said parallel because the way that these eyes are sticking up, they look like they're equal distance from one another. So I would say this is an example of parallel lines, the squirrel's ears. All right, let's go to the next picture. All right, take a look at this one. All right, it looks like two branches or two leaves of barley or wheat laying on top of one another, and they're crossing. Because they're crossing right here, they touch one another. This would be an example of what? Did you say intersecting? I hope you did, because you would have the right answer. Right. Whenever something connects or crosses over one another, that's an example of intersecting lines. All right, let's go on to the next ones. A little bit different. Here's some pictures of two horses. You might say, Mrs. Smith, I don't see any lines anywhere. Take a closer look. If you look right here, do you see the rail right here? And then what about right here? Okay, the rail that's keeping the horses inside would be an example of parallel lines. I mean, you can see right here how these two, well, they would have to be an equal distance from one another in order for it to be an effective fence. If you think of a fence that you've seen on the farm, the rails are always the same distance. So the fence is an example of parallel lines. Now you might also even say the lines that come from the horses' heads, okay? They touch these lines, and that would be an example of intersecting lines. So we had an example of both of them here. All right, good. All right. Oh, look at this one. He's so cute. A little dog. Looks like he might be sunbathing. Okay, now do you see any example of either parallel or intersecting lines? I say, I don't see anything, Mrs. Smith. Well, there's a few. Take a close look. Okay, one, look at the way the dog has his paws crossed. I know it's awfully cute. Since his paws are crossed, that would be an example of intersecting lines, wouldn't it? And then also, if you're looking really closely, look back here. I'm not sure what they are, but it looks like something that's going up. The picture's cut off, so we can't see them, but they're all equal distance from one another. I would say that's an example of parallel lines. And then even right here, it looks like maybe a pile of wood. The edges of the wood make lines. We could say these lines that are going across could be examples of parallel lines. And maybe even the lines that are going vertical could be examples of intersecting lines. There's lots of them here. More than we thought when we first looked at it. All right. How are you doing? Take a look at this picture. Whoa! Lots of lines here, aren't there? All right. So what do you see? All right. We have some lines that are going vertical, don't we? All right. And because they're windows, frames of windows, they're not going to touch. So they would be examples of parallel lines. Same things would happen with the horizontal lines as well. These are all examples of horizontal lines, examples of parallel lines. But what about the lines that go vertical and then go horizontal? Those would be examples of intersecting lines. Yeah, so we have both of them illustrated here. All right, good job. All right, this one's fun. Take a look at this car. Isn't that fun? Oh my goodness, I don't know how many people you can get in there. Not enough, probably. All right, but look at the top of the car. Okay, this is actually part of England's flag. Okay, it's red, white, and blue. All right, well, if you take a look at the lines, right here in the center, you have lines that cross over to make a cross. That would be an example of intersecting lines. And then even underneath that cross, we see lines that make a big X. And that would be an example of intersecting lines as well. All right, okay. Question, what about these lines right here on the hood? Would you say they're intersecting or are they parallel? All right, well, look closely. I would dare say that these lines would be intersecting. Now you might say, but Mrs. Smith, they're not crossing. Nope, they're not crossing yet. What I'm looking at is, look at how far the lines are right here towards the top. It's further than they are here towards the front of the hood. That makes me think that as the lines continue traveling, that eventually they're going to cross. So I would say these lines on the hood would be intersecting. All right. You're like, I don't know, Mrs. Smith. Okay, we'll take a look at these. All right, what about this one? All right, it's a cable car. Okay, what kind of lines do you see? Okay, well, let's first talk about these lines that run along the side of the railroad car. Okay, they are the same distance from one another, and they don't end up touching. So they must be examples of parallel lines. Very good. And then also right here in the front, okay, we have a line here and a line here. They're the same distance apart. That would be another example of parallel lines. But you know what? I see an example of intersecting lines as well. Do you? Yeah? All right. This is what I see. These lines right here in the front of the car, they're parallel. Okay. But look at this line right here. Yep. It touches. It touches the other two. So these two lines and the one here along the top would be an example of intersecting lines. Yeah. Okay, just one more. One more. Okay. All right. Now, railroad tracks are often used to describe parallel lines. Because as you look at these tracks, they have to be equal distance from one another in order for a train to travel on it. So they are parallel lines. Here's another pair of tracks, parallel. Even though it bends and it goes around a curve, they always stay the same distance away from one another. Same thing with these. Has a little bit of a curve. This one looks pretty straight. But I see something else. These tracks right here, see right here, they cross over one another. So this track and this track, they have a set of lines that intersect right here. Same thing right here, they intersect. And then this track intersects with this one because the lines cross over one another, and so does this one. So this is actually an example of both. Parallel lines, when we look at the tracks individually, and then intersecting lines when we see them cross over one another. All right, so how'd you do? All right, so do you have a better idea of what parallel and intersecting lines are? All right, so let's go ahead and look at the exercise at the bottom. They've asked us to identify whether the pair of lines is intersecting or parallel. So let's remember, parallel lines, they're the same distance from one another, they're never going to touch. Whereas intersecting lines are lines that they're either touching at the moment, or maybe because of their direction, they're eventually going to touch one another. All right, so looking at number one, intersecting or parallel. All right, I definitely would say they're intersecting because they're touching right here. Yeah, if they're touching, they're intersecting. So for number one, definitely I for intersecting. All right, for number two. Okay, now so we're all going to agree that they are equal distance from one another. I tried my best to make them as straight as I could. So if we're all going to agree that they're the same distance from one another and they're not going to touch, what kind of lines are they? You would have to say P for parallel. All right, so put a P right there. Parallel. All right, and for number three, again, we're going to agree that they are straight lines the same distance from one another. They're never going to touch. Okay, if they're never going to touch one another and the same distance from one another, it has to be P, parallel lines. Very good. All right, good. All right, and then one more. All right, for number four, take a look at these lines. All right, we have a vertical line that's going up and down, and then we have a diagonal line. They're not touching. But I have a feeling that if these lines were extended, what do you think would happen? Here, I'm gonna try it out. All right, so I'm gonna draw a dotted line. Okay, so I'm extending that line. You see that? And then I'm going to extend this line too. Did you see what happened? They end up touching or intersecting. So even though at this very moment, this instant in the illustration of these two lines are not touching, if you're paying attention to the direction of the line and where they're going, you would have to say they are intersecting lines. So I'm going to put I'll make it nice and dark. I for intersecting. All right, okay, so those are the two lines that we're talking about today. Parallel lines, same distance from one another, never going to touch. Like I said, think of two friends going for a nice long walk, and they're walking beside one another. And they're never going to cross paths or bump into one another. They're just having a nice stroll, walking side by side. Whereas the other type of line is intersecting lines. You have to be careful because that's when the lines are bumping to one another. Okay? Because they touch or they intersect or end up crossing over one another. All right. For the rest of your assignment on page 212, you're to go through, for the first section, do something very similar to what we just did just now. P for parallel, I for intersecting. And then for number 9, they want you to think of your capital letters. They want you to think of uppercase or capital letters that have intersecting lines. That means lines that cross over one another. Okay? And so you're to give 3 examples, but I have a feeling there's more than 3. And then for number 10, okay, they've given you some lines and they've labeled them with letters, and you're to put them in the right category. You're supposed to list which lines are the pairs of lines that are parallel, and then the pairs of lines that are intersecting. They've given you an example, okay, just to give you an idea. And then for 11 and 12, they want you to illustrate a parallel line next to the snake that's already drawn there, and then illustrate another snake intersecting with the one that they've drawn there. All right, and then when you're done, you'll just go on to the assignment. I've given you a screenshot of the answer so you can see how you did, which I'm sure you're going to do absolutely wonderful. All right, guys, let's keep on working hard so later on we can play hard. All right, talk to you later, guys. Bye.